It's a real extreme honor to introduce George Lakey. Uh, I've had extra honor in being with him for the past 2 days, and I want to give a shout out to Mike McCormick. I hope that many of you listened to the radio interview this morning in which George described the importance of being on the offense for social justice, which is really the whole reason, the whole focus of this weekend is that we need to be on the offense if we're going to get there to where we need to be. And that interview this morning is videotaped by Mike and will be available. And I told George if he doesn't need to say anything other than exactly what he said this morning because it was so exciting and turning on people. How many people saw it or heard it? Great, a bunch of you, but it will be available, I think, Mike, maybe next week, but we'll definitely blast it out there for you, along with another shout out to Mike of Mind Over Matters KEXP Radio, who is who has interviewed our speakers over the last 5, 6, 7 years, I don't remember, and made videotapes available to us, which we can spread around the single-payer community. To PNHP National picks it up, and Mike is just such a wonderful thing. Now back to George. Now, John mentioned a giant, Quentin Young, the giant, the most respected person in healthcare advocacy, social justice advocacy over the last 50 or 60 years. Now, and Quentin spoke at 2 of our meetings. That was really an honor. And, you know, Margaret Flowers spoke here too, and she's, you know, and Carol are the forefront of single payer now. But George, like Quentin, is a giant in the nonviolent resistance movement in the past 50 or 60 years in this country. And it's such an honor, and you'll, after you listen to him for 5 minutes, you'll agree that this was the best possible thing you could do tonight. George, I first, you know, I'm sure I've read your stuff in the past, but recently I saw the article in Popular Resistance that Margaret Flowers puts out, and everybody should be on that email thing that comes out every day, popularresistance.org. A couple of George's recent articles in Waging Nonviolence, an organization that he writes regularly for, 2 of them are included in the folder, and the one I saw was 10 points on how to resist Trump. And so you can take that home and look it over and digest it. But in looking a little bit at George's history, I found that there's some real interesting connections there. First of all, taught at Swarthmore, where 3 of the members of our board went. Sherry, myself, and Seth Armstrong over there. So there was that connection. And then when he was first year in college, he was like the editor of that college newspaper, and he was such a trouble to the authorities that he was invited to leave there for being such a radical who couldn't be controlled of what he was saying in the local newspaper. So he enrolled in Cheney University, which was an all-black college just outside of Philadelphia and very close to Swarthmore, and was the first white graduate of that black college. So the other connection is my dad, a few years later, got a master's degree in sociology there, you know, later in his life, having worked his whole life in the cooperative movement, and stayed at Cheney to teach for 3 or 4 years and lived at Pendle Hill, the Quaker place that George was, you know, closely associated with. Now, George, after leaving Cheney, became involved in the civil rights movement in the South, which was very heated up at that time in the early 60s. And it got involved in training white students to go down and support their black brothers and sisters, putting their lives on the line to fight the evil that was going on there, and developed a training manual that was used throughout that time period. His first arrest was at a sit-in for civil rights causes. A couple of years later, in 1967, I think it was, he was on a boat, the Phoenix, that took medical supplies to Buddhists in Vietnam who were, the authorities there didn't like what they were doing because they were anti-war. So he put his life again on the line there and taking those supplies. So since then, basically it's the same kind of thing he's been doing. He's always walking the walk, not just talking the talk. He's very much, a leader in the theory, strategy, and tactics of nonviolent resistance, and started a database at Swarthmore College that's referred to by people around the world about how nonviolent resistance movements have won. And that's what he's going to talk about tonight. And it basically, the message is you got to be on the offense. So it's a real honor to have this guy who's puts himself out there, his life and his physical health on the line, like. Oh.
Thank you. Wow. I'm touched by your introduction. It's an honor to be here. It's an honor to be introduced that way. It's an honor to see a bunch of you that actually I know from before. And it's an honor also to hear Carol's description of a road to empowerment that is really inspiring. Because power is central to the chance, right, of our gaining single-payer health care. And I believe, I'll make the assumption, I won't argue this, I'll just make the assumption that the more powerful we are, the more of what we want will be available to us. Conversely, the less powerful we are, the smaller the amount of what we want is what we'll get. Let me illustrate. In Montgomery, Alabama, in 1955, black people found that the racist bus system was a horrible thing, right? Now, if someone had said to them, well, let's see if we can make a deal. Let's negotiate with the bus company. We're 50,000 people, so let's see what kind of deal we can negotiate. That kind of negotiation would, at best, have resulted in maybe one black bus driver on a route that went through the black neighborhoods. Not exactly world-changing, right? Because it would be looking at the black population in relation to the white population as things were at the time. But black people didn't go that route. They said, let's generate power. Let's empower ourselves and generate power such that we could get what we want. Well, what they wanted, of course, was equal access to the bus system, right? So that white people could get on and sit wherever they wanted to on the bus. Very reasonable request from our point of view, but there had never been done. There's no way they could have gotten it by asking for it. There's no way they could have gotten it by lobbying the city council of Montgomery. They could only get it by generating power that forced the Montgomery bus system to be transformed. Now, there are a lot of people who will pretend to be wise about American politics, who act as if, in relation to single payer, it's 1955 in Montgomery, and we haven't yet acted. And they'll take a look at, yes, they'll take a look at opinion polls, but basically, they won't give very much to the aspiration that we share here. Why should they? Because it's like 1955 before there's been a bus boycott in Montgomery. It's like 1955 before there's been an empowerment process that makes us a force to be reckoned with. And so they can tweak here, tweak there, but we'll get very little of what we want. Because we can only get what we want if we're powerful enough to demand it. And that is the story over and over and over of successful nonviolent direct action campaigns. Women declared in 1848 they wanted the right to vote. Decade after decade after decade, did they get it? No, 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 no. Not until they empowered themselves through nonviolent direct action, went after a target named Woodrow Wilson, name familiar to you, I think, and made his life so miserable at the White House gates and made such an incredibly disruptive scene through the nonviolent direct action they engaged in that they could demand and get women's suffrage. If they had not done that, if they'd politely requested or said, we're half the population, you have to do this, as if rationality is what governs the decisions of political figures, we would still not have women's right to vote. We only get what we demand, and we only get what we demand powerfully. And so the story of empowerment that you describe, of putting yourself in situations of discomfort, right? And you admitted to being scared. I'm still, even though I've been arrested for these many years, I'm still scared every time I am. It's going outside the comfort zone, doing the tough thing. And I'd like to talk some now about the collective journey, because you've talked about the individual journey. So the collective journey. Well, let me refer to 1993. You remember, that was the Hillary Clinton presided upon, right? Healthcare reform effort. And the broad-based citizens coalition that was supposed to be making that happen was losing big time when I got the phone call. They asked me, a member of that coalition, a leader, said, please come to Washington and consult with us because our chance to get a decent health care plan is going down the tubes. And as a last resort, we're willing to consider nonviolent direct action. So would you come down and tell us what to do? So, okay, I care about this very much. So I went down, and large group, labor union leadership, seniors leadership, the leadership of a lot of citizens organizations, right? Liberal organizations of various kinds. No politicians, but the organizations that were a coalition pushing for this, right? And they were looking very sad. And I said, okay, well, before I start offering suggestions, I want to know who I'm talking to. So let me just check, where's the rebel energy in the room? Please identify yourself if you are abundant with rebel energy. I saw eyes staring at the ceiling. I saw eyes looking at the floor. I waited. And then someone said, well, ACT UP left the coalition 3 years ago. Oh. Waited some more. Well, the people with disabilities, they left the coalition, 2 years ago? And so on. They named the groups that were carrying the rebel energy in that coalition at the start, that bailed because the probably tacit, probably unwritten consensus among the leadership was this will not be an expression of rebel energy. This campaign that we're doing is not going to be that kind of campaign. And the people with the rebel energy left, as they should, because why bother to sit around waiting till people tried to jawbone politicians into doing the right thing? I mean, politicians, if there's anybody who's expert in jawboning, it's politicians, right? They know jawboning when they hear it, when they see it. Why should that move them? It's power. It's power that moves them. And so those other groups had bailed. So I, noting these confessions, said, well, thank goodness there's still time. I can catch a movie before I go back to Philadelphia. Because there's never been a successful campaign that has pushed as big agenda as you have without rebel energy. And if this coalition can't hold on and cherish and honor its rebel energy, it's done anyway. And we're certainly not going to do a nonviolent direct action campaign at this late moment without rebel energy, because it cannot be done. So thank goodness, I love movies actually, and Washington always has a good selection, so I'm not going to waste my time. And ever since, I've been looking for a coalition of people who care deeply about healthcare, who are willing to honor and support rebel energy, who understand that it's only by making ourselves powerful that we can get something substantial. And if we keep remaining relatively powerless, then we will not get what we want. I think some of you remember HCAN. I was very interested in throwing myself into the fight for healthcare at the time that Obama entered the office, and I'd thrown myself, as David said, into previous causes. So I investigated. I found out that the job of HCAN was to stamp out and make it invisible and push out any sign of rebel energy that might show up at that time. They were intentionally, I don't think they understood it the way you and I understand it right now, but the impact of their work was to minimize the amount of possible effectiveness and power from a citizens coalition. It was a heartbreaking thing to see. Show up in meeting after meeting and see people marginalized who were bringing the power that would be necessary to make a public option, for example, possible, much less single payer. And as that movement continued to work, I watched then from a distance, because I had better things to do, in my opinion. I watched them be so unstrategic that they wouldn't even name an opponent. Some of you will remember this. They wouldn't even name who it was they were against. Now, it's a basic law of strategy. When you are campaigning for something, you name your opponent, and you engage your opponent, and you discredit your opponent. That's fundamental. We would never have heard the name of Dr. Martin Luther King if he didn't know that. We wouldn't have women's suffrage if they hadn't known that. It's fundamental, but that coalition would not do it. HCAN absolutely would not. Barack Obama was president of the United States at the time. He was kind of busy. He had an entire empire to manage, right? And he had many irons in the fire, right? So, of course, he wanted a health bill. That was what he wanted. But he wanted to be president at the same time and do the work of a president. Now, it's the job of the movement to do the movement's work, and it's the job of the president to do the president's work. But there were a lot of people in the movement who thought they ought to be led by the president, that the president should do two roles. He should be over here being president and over here being leader of the movement at the same time. It was embarrassing to have a movement, a social movement, be that naive about how power works. So finally, Barack Obama bails them out by naming the private health insurance industry as the enemy. He finally did that. And when he did that, I felt, on the one hand, well, at last it's been done, because I've been embarrassed myself that it hadn't been done yet. But then it was also, I just felt, he had a community organizing background, right? So he knew the basics. He'd read his Zelensky and so on. But I was just so embarrassed on HCAN's behalf that they wouldn't do what needs to be the elementary thing of naming your opponent. Now, I think it's conceivable to me, not knowing you very well, that you could make the same mistake. That you could sally forth in this next year or two of a tremendous opening, the biggest opportunity that there's been for major healthcare change since that time, 2009, and you might hold back also from naming your opponent, as far as I know, because it's possible to imagine that somehow plausible rationality will carry the day, as if this government makes its policy on the basis of rationality, as if politicians could care less about rationality. If they'd done that, we would have had, Harry Truman would have gotten his way in 1946, right? We'd be catching up with the industrialized world. It's not a policy thing. It's a question of power. And it's only if we're willing to commit to being powerful that we're going to get what we want. Okay, so first of all, really important to commit to campaigning, doing nonviolent direct action campaigning, naming an opponent, whether that's a pharmaceutical firm that puts people's lives in danger because it ups the price of pharmacies, of a medicine, or it's some other abuse. There's no lack of them, right? To grab one of those, run with it, and use that as an example in order to mobilize people. Now, would this be a new thing? This would be actually as old as the hills. Because as David pointed out, we've got that all over the place in our database of people taking something that is understandable, that doesn't require a book, but only is very, very clear, and then build the campaign around that. Do you remember that it was in Greensboro, 1960, February 1st, 4 students went out of their dorm, right, and sat down at the lunch counter and asked for a cup of coffee and started a campaign for a cup of coffee as black students. They knew they'd have to go back and back and back and back. It was not a one-off demonstration. It was not an expression of opinion. It was the beginning of a campaign, and they stayed with it, right? But a historically black college a couple counties away noticed they were doing that and thought, well, they can do that, we can do that. So then they tackled their lunch counter, and another, and another, and another. And it became multiple campaigns. Very clear. Notice what a campaign is. A campaign is a sustained set of actions that target an opponent, that target somebody, some specific nameable thing, and expose an abuse, expose an injustice. And do it in such a sustained and sometimes escalated way that there's a good chance of winning. So this is not a dialogue. This is not speaking truth to power. That's not what the civil rights movement was about. It is speaking truth with power. That's what gets things done. And that's why the civil rights movement has to be understood as one of our major sources of guidance if this movement that you're involved with is going to win. Because that movement engaged in a process in a similar way, in a similar situation as you do. That is to say, they had 2 major political parties that did not want what they wanted. John Kennedy told Martin Luther King to his face, eyeball to eyeball, I do want what you want, but there's no way I'm going to take a step to make a civil rights bill possible for you. I'm not going to take that step. That was the Democratic side, and the Republican side was offering nothing better. And the federal government was also attacking the civil rights movement through the FBI. And the states were against, in the South, right? Against the civil rights movement. Governors, legislatures, and so on. The police. And the Ku Klux Klan, the most developed and sustained terrorist organization our country has generated, was against the civil rights movement. An array of power that is mind-boggling was against that movement. And who won? The movement won. The movement won. We can learn a lot from that if we're feeling sometimes when we get up in the morning a bit overwhelmed. I mean, if you feel overwhelmed sometimes, try being in 1963 or 1962, right? In the Deep South, wanting racial justice. How did they do it? Through campaigns. It could be as simple and as clear-cut as asking for a cup of coffee, or organizationally much more elaborate as doing a bus boycott, and on and on and on. I don't have to tell you history that is so accessible, but that willingness to start small and then build specific targeted campaigns inspires other people to do campaigns, inspires still other people to do campaigns, and you've got what we call a movement that makes John Kennedy sweat enough so that he has to get on the phone with the head of U.S. Steel, right, the economic elite, get on the phone with others of the economic elite and say, okay, we have to give these people what they want. That's what empowerment looks like collectively. We've heard Carol talk about individual empowerment. That's what empowerment looks like collectively. This group, the group in this room, could start a campaign like that. It could start a highly dramatic campaign that would win, through its drama and its integrity, so much attention that it would attract to it way more people, and in that way grow and escalate. You could do that. The current organization that I'm part of started in a living room. Through nonviolent direct action, we grew to 13 states in 5 years. And we forced the 7th largest bank out of in the country out of financing mountaintop removal coal mining, which was very profitable at the time. In fact, it was the #1 financier of mountaintop removal coal mining. A group in the living room did that by empowering itself systematically. So that's the invitation here. Okay, but is that realistic? I mean, there are bound to be questions still. Like, is that really the way history works? And that's why the study of the Nordic countries, reflected in my book, is so important to me, and why I'm running around. I want to tell you, by the way, that in bookstores, when I talk about what the Nordic countries' healthcare system is like, you should see the bells, you should see the eyes light up. You should kind of tell what the bells ringing inside people are, because they ask more questions about that. How did they get it? How did they get it? I've been, Arizona, New Hampshire, Alaska, Georgia, all over the country, and that's what I find is a button that is more important than any other of the many things that the Nordic countries do. People coming to a bookstore care about healthcare. This is such a beautiful time for you. But what do they ask? They ask, well, how did they get it? Practical Americans, right? How did they get it? And then I explain, well, they developed mass movement so strong that they could push the economic elite out of the way and get what they wanted. You'll say, what? That's possible? And that's when I tell the civil rights story again. Under way harder conditions than, I'm just guessing, I don't know you personally, but I'll bet way harder conditions than you've ever endured. Right? And they did it in our country. And they've done it in other countries, and it's possible. But what then becomes possible, what becomes highly predictable, is that the politicians will come to you. That is, the orientation we have from our civics books in 7th grade are that if we want something, we go to politicians and ask for it, right? We have been programmed. That is our programming. You could probably name the teachers in your middle school that told you that's the way things work. But, you know, things haven't exactly been working well that way, right? All right. So we could take another point of view, which is that that's not the way things actually work. But instead, that we create power and then the politicians come to us. So some friends of mine tried that in Philadelphia not long ago. They thought, okay, we want to build a neighborhood-based insurrection against casino gambling. Philadelphia had been selected as the biggest city so far to foist casinos on. And so it was in the works. You know, it was kind of, you know, politicians were bought and so on, so that would be happening. And my friends said, let's do an experiment. We'll do two parts of this experiment. The first part is that we will not go to the politicians. Now, keeping casinos out of a city does require the politicians to be involved, right? They have to create a policy and so on and so on. You have to get there sometime, but we won't go to them. Instead, and this is what they did, we will create so much power at the grassroots through nonviolent direct action that they will come to us. And then they made bets, kind of playful, you know, like, I think it'll be 3 months. No, I think it'll be 2.5 months. No, I think they'll come out, you know, I think you guys are unrealistic. 4 months. Make little bets. When will the politicians come to us? But sure, that's exactly what they did. They made drama, they organized people, and there were the politicians. How can we help? Because the job of politicians, this was not in the 7th grade civics textbook. Okay, it's all right. But what really happens in politics is that the job of politicians is to curry favor with the emerging movements so that they get a reputation as being the champions of the people. And they will come to you. And that's exactly what happened. Not only did all the usual suspect politicians of the Democratic Party come to this Philadelphia campaign, but even the state senator who had introduced the bill to have casinos in Philadelphia came to them and said, "How can I help?" Meaning, how can I help you defeat my own bill? That's the nature of politicians. I'm not saying, you know, every single one. Of course, we have principled politicians. Thank goodness there was one on the screen tonight. I'm just saying, in general, let's make realistic expectations of politicians' behavior, how major parties work, and then, even though there's a role for advocacy with politicians, not believe that that's where that's not the main basket that we put our eggs in. Because that has failed on single payer, that's failed on almost every issue I can think of, as long as it's been the major instrumentality. Whereas nonviolent direct action has an amazing history of success. Make a fuss, the politicians will come to you. Why is that so important? That's so important because this country is entering a time of dramatic change on many fronts. So that there's a whole context here, right? This isn't just about any single issue. It's not only about abuse of black people by police. It's not only about flushing public schools down the toilet. It's not about the climate crisis and so on singly. It's about all these things coming to a surface at once. What that means, and there was reference to this earlier, is that we will get what we want in the context of many movements getting what they want. And so what actually needs to be built is a movement of movements such that the economic elite will be pushed out of the way and we can do what the Nordics did. Because what the Nordics realized was that the individual interests of the various interest groups were all being blocked by the same bunch of people. And Warren Buffett named that in 2002 to the New York Times. He admitted that the reporter asked him, "What's this thing about class war that we hear, Mr. Buffett?" And Mr. Buffett said, "Well, there is class war. And my class, the rich, started it. And we're winning," said Warren Buffett. The New York Times printed that. Folks, this is way bigger than any group's single issue. Because everybody, all the progressive causes are being blocked by people who understand only power. But the opportunity of empowerment, just as we see it in the face of Carol when she describes what her personal experience of empowerment is, that is also the Nordics' experience of collective empowerment. Because when they empowered themselves through collective, nonviolent direct action movements, they transformed themselves and became the Nordic countries that we like to visit today and that I like to wear the sweater of. Thanks very much. This has been a pleasure.